drops on news posts and comments. Protesters at rallies shut down silence. When you can't stop this, we keep on living. Where they break necks and bullets and base in. Some look away and dismiss the movement. They ignore the problem, bring no solutions. You're a devil's advocate, but all I see is the devil in denial. You want to keep the issue invisible, talking of survival. When race determines fate in a police state, where they'd rather lock up than educate, being real. It's dealing with love, breaking and healing. After lynchings, murders, and killings, emotions and feelings. That's why Black Lives Matter, I yell it. You can get mad, I hashtag and spell it until you can feel it. Time to rise up, get up, move, stand above. Enough is enough. Time to break out of these clubs. Oh, we don't write these songs. We hear what you say, we just play along. It's what you made. How could you say we're wrong? The building's on fire, but the band ready wrong. Segregated, suffocated, agitated, implicated, poverty, incarcerated, but I'm not intimidated. Black and underestimated, underrated, amputated feet. Still I'm dancing with my people in the street. Freedom of the mental is the secret, confidential. Pop a pistol or a pencil, start the clip into the mic. Easy knocks, easy fight, easy mic, freeze a cop and catch a flight. I might strike a match and burn that funky Bill of Rights. That house they painted white and every race is on the right. I really wanna sing, but too much anger in my lungs. Conservatives, can I live? Can I love? Can I teach? Can I thug? If I'm thugging for a cause. Operation, liberation, honesty, and education. Telling lies, we catching bullets for the truth. Oh, we don't write these songs. We hear what you say, and we just play along. This is what you made. How could you say we're wrong? The building's on fire, but the band playing wrong. Something in the water got our babies breathing harder. Something in the food keep us in a lazy mood. Something on the screen got a murder for the green. A mirror or the rhymes, a reflection of the time. Black Lives Matter, a reflection of the time. Sandra Bland, a reflection of the time. Eric Garner, a reflection of the time. Jordan Baker, a reflection of the time. Tamir Rice, a reflection of the time. Mike Brown, a reflection of the time. Ronaldo Cueva, a reflection of the time. Yvette Smith, a reflection of the time. A reflection of the time. A reflection of the time.
Hola a todas, todes y todos. Mi nombre es Gloria y yo soy parte de la colectiva de Comal de Justicia del Lenguaje y soy una de las intérpretes de hoy. Hello everybody, my name is Gloria and I'm part of Comal Language Justice Collective and I'm one of the interpreters for today.
Hola, hola a todos. Mi nombre es María y yo soy parte de Comal Colectiva de Justicia del Lenguaje y soy uno de los intérpretes hoy. Hello everyone, my name is María and I'm with Comal Language Justice Collective and I'm one of your interpreters today.
Primero que nada, quiero agradecer a los organizadores de este seminario web por priorizar la justicia del lenguaje.
First, I would like to thank the organizers of this webinar for prioritizing language justice.
La justicia del lenguaje es el derecho a participar plenamente con el idioma que la persona se sienta más cómoda.
Language justice is the right to participate fully with a language that they feel most comfortable.
Nosotros creemos que la justicia se puede alcanzar a través de la solidaridad significativa que transciende las barreras lingüísticas.
We believe that justice can be achieved through meaningful solidarity that transcends language barriers. Next slide, please.
Próxima diapositiva, por favor. Antes de empezar, queremos compartir unas cuantas patas que todos podemos usar para crear este espacio multilingüe. Es importante mencionar que todos nosotros somos responsables en esto.
Before we start, we would like to share some guidelines for everyone so that we can create a multilingual space. It is important to mention that we are all responsible for this.
Primero, como estamos en un espacio virtual, les queremos pedir que antes de hablar digan su nombre para que todos sepan quién es la persona que habla.
Before because we're in a virtual space, we ask that before you speak, you say your name so that everyone knows that who is speaking.
Segundo, hay veces que las personas están bien emocionadas cuando hablan y que hablan súper, súper, súper rápido y nosotros los intérpretes no podemos entender todo. Si eso pasa, nosotros pondremos un mensaje en el chat para indicarles que hablen más despacio. Si no toman nota, tendremos que intervenir.
Secondly, there are times when a person gets really excited and they speak super, super fast, and us as interpreters, we cannot understand it. If this happens, we will write a message in the chat to indicate to slow down, and we will intervene if people don't take note.
Otras veces nos ponemos un poco nerviosos y empezamos a murmurar y nosotros los intérpretes tampoco podemos entender. Entonces es importante asegurarse de hablar claro y que su micrófono funcione.
Other times we're a little nervous and begin to mumble, and as interpreters, we can't understand. So it's important that you speak clearly and ensure that your microphone is working.
También les vamos a pedir que si no están hablando, que por favor se pongan en silencio para que todos podamos escuchar a la persona que está hablando.
We also ask that if you are not speaking, please mute yourself so that we can hear the person who is speaking.
Por último, les vamos a recordar que por favor hablen uno a la vez para que nosotros no tengamos que priorizar una voz sobre la otra y que también les queremos pedir cordialmente que por favor sigan con ese mismo idioma porque en Zoom hace difícil cambiar idiomas en medio de una oración.
Lastly, we want to remind you to please speak one at a time so that we don't have to prioritize one voice over the other. We kindly ask that you stick to one language when speaking because Zoom makes it difficult to switch mid-sentence between languages. Next slide, please.
Próxima diapositiva, por favor. Ahora, cuando la interpretación se haga disponible, podrán ver un globo terráqueo y ver el lenguaje que quieran participar. O si están en su celular app, podrán hacerle clic en los 3 puntitos. Recuerden que si no quieren escuchar el audio original, de apagarlo.
When the interpretation is enabled, you will see a globe where you can choose the language you are participating in. Or if you're using the app on your phone, you will see you can do this by clicking on the 3 dots. Remember that if you do not want to hear the original audio, you can turn it off.
En conclusión, si tienen algún problema con la interpretación, por favor de comunicarse por el chat o simplemente digan algo y no sufran en silencio. Queremos que todos puedan participar de manera plena.
Finally, if you have any problems with the interpretation, please communicate in the chat or say something and do not suffer in silence. We want everyone to participate fully.
Este seminario web va a ser bilingüe en inglés y en español con oportunidades para que las personas puedan hacer su pregunta. Entonces les vamos a pedir a todos que por favor elijan un idioma.
This chat is being provided by interpretation. So we're going to ask that everyone please choose a language so that we can, everyone can participate fully.
Muchas gracias, eso es todo.
Thank you very much. That is all.
Y en este momento pueden prender la función de interpretación. You can now turn on the interpretation function.
Good evening. My name is Alex Brunel. I'm originally from Panama, but I've lived in San Antonio for the majority of my life, and I'm the advocacy manager at Move Texas. I support youth organizers across the state of Texas organizing around voting rights, climate justice, and criminal justice reform. I've worked to defeat voter registration bills at the Texas Ledge, to see that workers of San Antonio are guaranteed paid sick time, and to preserve the land next to the Hayes Street Bridge against commercialization, among other fights. Tonight, I'm glad to be joined by members of the Defund SAPD Coalition, the Black Futures Collective, Texas Appleseed, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, to discuss defunding the police and reimagining public safety. The purpose of this webinar is to reckon with the crisis of inequality and segregation that characterizes the city of San Antonio, and to draw the connection between that condition of tattered and fragmented social safety nets and the management of that instability and hardship through policing. We want our audience to grapple with 2 things. 1, that in a racist society, police with the deadly tools that they possess do not create safety, but instead produce violence disproportionately meted out on Black and Brown and Indigenous people. And that 2, budgets of police departments across the country, San Antonio is no exception here. Policing has been made the public policy of last resort, a paradigm of criminalizing and brutalizing symptoms of instability rather than treating root causes. a lack of basic resources for a good life: housing, healthcare, quality transit that connects communities, a dignified and well-compensated form of work, and compensated jobs. This is the political proposition of defunding the police, that it is possible to have a city abundant with goods and services readily available to people who both need them and want to enjoy them, if we did not expend so much money on the police. We have to look at status quo San Antonio and understand that we did not become the city with the greatest concentrations of poverty by accident. We did not become the city where your zip code correlates with a 20-year difference in life expectancy by accident. We are segregated. Our workers lack paid sick time. Our food bank lines make national headlines. People whose schools close, people who lack basic workplace protections, and people who are hungry are unsafe. We have to ask ourselves, what do guns, tasers, and handcuffs and jail cells do to address any of this? Square pegs, round holes. Carceral abuse layered on top of the abuse of poverty. The flip side of this relationship is that local businesses use the police to enforce order and create a disturbance-free ambiance. The police view themselves this way too. Take this recent quote from Mike Kelly, former San Antonio Police Union president, discussing cite and release. If criminal trespass for the homeless is no longer going to be in effect, why not just camp out right outside the Alamo? Kelly, in the same interview, also questioned the impact homeless people might have on downtown businesses if law enforcement is unable to get them to relocate. It's been said that budgets reflect priorities. The conversation about defunding the police is about changing priorities. And let's be absolutely clear. It's imperative that we change priorities to affirm the value of Black lives. When Black housing matters, all housing matters. When Black schooling matters, all schooling matters. When Black jobs have dignity, decent pay, and benefits, all jobs have dignity, decent pay, and benefits. Black Lives Mattering is a prerequisite to that better world really being possible, and our city's budget and the police union contract that ties it up is a concrete thing that we can organize to change so that something better isn't continually postponed and deferred. It is an honor and a pleasure to explore this topic tonight at length with local organizers. Celeste Alana Brown is a San Antonio native committed to advocating for equity and the advancement of Black and brown communities. She is passionate about working to help people realize the power their voices carry through issue education, civic engagement, and advocacy. She has worked in the movement for Black lives since 2014 and is currently a member of the Black Futures Collective and the Defund Coalition of San Antonio. Marlon Davis was born and raised on the East Side. Marlon emerged as one of the most powerful voices calling for the preservation of the historic Hay Street Bridge. His outspoken advocacy suggests that the fire of larger-than-life East Side activists that preceded him may be passing to a new generation. Beyond fighting to protect the Hay Street Bridge, Davis has played a role in the local activism related to systemic racism and is a member of the Black Futures Collective and the Defund Coalition in San Antonio. Kiamber Thompson grew up on the west side and east sides of San Antonio. She has experience in environmental justice and prison abolition organizing in Southern California, where she has lived for 4 years. And she is now a member of the Black Futures Collective and the Defund Coalition in San Antonio. Kiamber is the founder and director of the Charles Roundtree Bloom Project, which facilitates nature-based activities to address the impact of incarceration on youth in San Antonio. Chris Harris is a native Texan, proud son, basketball fanatic, hip hop head, and a passionate advocate to work to transform the criminal legal system. He currently serves as the director of Texas Appleseed's Criminal Justice Project. Chris has led and contributed to winning campaigns aimed at limiting racial disparities in the criminal justice system, state violence, unnecessary arrests, ICE detentions, pretrial incarceration, subpar indigent defense, and further investment in police and prisons. Carolina Canizales. Carolina grew up undocumented in San Antonio. She has organized for immigrant rights for 11 years. Currently, she works at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center to pass policies across Texas localities that decriminalize communities. Jonathan David Jones. Jonathan David Jones is a Black Lives Matter activist from Houston, Texas, who has done most of his work in San Antonio. Through his engagement with Black Lives Matter, he found himself an intersectional ally to many issues impacting oppressed peoples. Since 2015, Jonathan has spearheaded many rallies in the San Antonio area. And then Denise M. Hernandez. Denise M. Hernandez is a fifth-generation San Antonian. She has been organizing against police brutality and as an ally to the movement for Black Lives since 2014. In 2016, she was selected to speak on the TEDx San Antonio stage about implicit biases and how they affect our communities. She is passionate about envisioning and creating a San Antonio where all voices are valued and implemented for long-standing, systemic, equitable change. Next, we're going to do an overview of the webinar, just to talk a little bit about the different sections we're going to address. So first, we're going to talk about why we need to defund the police and why we need to do it in this moment. Next, we're going to talk about the role of the police union. Then we're going to talk about opportunities for divestment from policing. Then we're going to talk about alternative health and safety investments. And then we're going to talk about how to make a difference in the budget. And then there will be an opportunity for the audience to engage in Q&A with some of our panelists. So with that, we can go ahead and get tonight's panel started. So we'll go ahead and start with the section on why defund the police and why now. And we'll go ahead and open that up with Chris. Chris, can you start us off talking about the status quo? What are some of the harms of over-policing?
All right, sure. Thank you, Alex, for having me. You can go to the next slide. So as we talk about the status quo, we talk about a system that views every social ill as something to be responded to via criminalization and ultimately the use of law enforcement. What we see is that over the last 30 years, that crime across the country, including in San Antonio, has plummeted, but police budgets and the number of officers keep going up and up. Also want to talk a little bit about that word crime here in a minute, but when we look at analysis of what police do, calls that are not related even to something called crime make up a third or more of the calls they get and they respond to in many cities. Traffic enforcement and accidents make up another 15+% of police response in many cities. And you see a chart here that shows you an example of 3 different cities. And even the things that we think of, or that many people think of or associate with policing most often, which is the response to quote unquote violent crime, makes up on average less than 1% of calls and about 4% of the time that officers actually spend. So when we talk about what is going on right now, it's a situation where the police are answer to everything, and very little of that is even the things that for folks that believe that we still need police, think that police should be doing, which is responding to these most serious things. The other thing I'll quickly point out too is that there's a model of community policing that's very celebrated across many cities and or pushed in many cities, even by reformers. What this often feeds into is what you see in this chart is the proactive policing time. And while it's meant to be in a time when police can build relationships in cities, but what it often means is that they're looking for and creating crime. And they're often doing it in the poorest communities, in communities that are overwhelmingly Black and brown. And it helps actually drive a lot of the disparities that we see in policing. I think the harms are quite obvious from this situation, which is that we have unceasing police violence and harm in our communities. And we have folks that are pulled into the criminal legal system largely on the basis of either the color of their skin or their poverty level, on the basis of the use of police for any and all issues in our communities.
Thank you for that, Chris. So next, if we could jump to Kiambra. Is it right to call for the defunding of the police at this moment? Is it a new thing? Has there been a need for this conversation prior to now? And what brings you to this fight?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Alex. Yeah, I wouldn't call this movement and these calls to defund a new thing. For a while, there's been cities like Los Angeles and Minnesota calling for divestment from the police and defunding the police. And yeah, the move to tactic has been used in other movements as well, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I think what is new is the traction of this movement that is picked up across cities, across cities in this country. And so divestment, why divest? Divestment is an abolitionist tactic, and with this tactic, we want to reduce the capacity of the existing state to harm our communities. And so by divesting from police, we are delegitimizing police. We delegitimize the idea that police should be the dominant response to social and economic problems in our communities. And so in this movement to defund police, we are also redefining safety. This is not only about moving monies from one place to another, we are also divesting from the idea that police make us safe in the first place. That more police in our communities, does not equal greater safety. Putting more money toward police technology like body cams don't equal safety, because they have those body cams on and they're still killing us. And so we need to invest in structures that actually make our community safer, such as affordable, safe, and accessible housing, education, community-based mental health services, youth programming, access to nutritious, culturally appropriate, and affordable food. And so these are the things that we already know actually make our community safer. And this is especially important now that we invest in public health and in healthcare during this COVID-19 pandemic. And during this pandemic, we've seen that our health system has not been able to respond effectively to the pandemic. And we're also, this pandemic has also highlighted who is most vulnerable. So in addition to Black folks and Indigenous folks and other people of color, folks who are in prison are also extremely vulnerable to this pandemic. And so, so defunding police, when we say defund police, we mean reducing the size, scope, and power of police departments. And this call to for divestment is always coupled with reinvestment. And so with reinvestment, we want to invest in and build community-based responses to harm and violence that don't rely on policing, surveillance, and punishment. I mentioned that, divestment, this isn't something new. It's been used in other moments. So more historically, it's been used in the anti-South African apartheid movement, which was driving individuals and businesses and institutions across the world to sell off their stocks from investment institutions, from businesses that were linked to the South African government. It's also been recently used in the movement for fossil fuel divestment. and then as well as in the Palestinian BDS, boycott, divest, sanction movement. And yeah, that's a campaign that's urging banks and councils, churches, and pension funds to withdraw their investments from the state of Israel.
Thank you so much for that, Camber. Real quick, before we jump into talking about COVID-related budget cuts, I wanted to ask Celeste, what are some of the demonstrated limits of policing? Do these reforms actually work?
Right. Thank you. And so there are numerous studies that show actually a lot of the things that would be considered reforms do not work. One example that we're maybe hearing a bit more these days, right, comes because of the bill that Congress is trying to pass right now. And two big things they talk about is a ban on chokeholds and a ban on no-knock warrants. Though we've seen in cases of, police violence, right, and state violence that, you can change the rules of the game, but it doesn't matter if the players are corrupt. And that is kind of how I view this completely, right? Because chokeholds were illegal in New York City where Eric Garner was murdered by police. And so there are many reforms and I can speak to the fact that when myself and Jonathan David Jones and Denise were doing this work back in 2015, 2016, I think there was a hope that things like body cameras and things like, getting citizens engaged on how we review activity, there was a hope that those things would be helpful. But then when you realize the system is broken by design and changing the rules of a broken system doesn't change anything, you realize that there's a lot of limitations, right? And I think the other thing I'll very briefly mention there is, one other thing that's been super popular on the internet, generally, right, with the general public has been 8 Can't Wait, which is a campaign from Campaign Zero, which also takes into account, right, the no-knock warrants, ban on chokeholds, citizens advisory boards, et cetera, et cetera. But a great resource to look at is 8 to Abolition, which talks a bit more about how to actually enact change, right? And realize that policing itself is doing what it was always meant to, right? Policing itself was created under the premise of harming Black folks, right? It was created, back in slave patrols, et cetera. And so I think if you look side by side between 8 Can't Wait and 8 to Abolition, 8 to Abolition breaks down why so many of these proposed reforms don't work. But you can't reform a system that's working exactly the way it was intended to.
Yeah, thank you for that, Celeste. Camber mentioned some comments about how the COVID pandemic has really illustrated how our society is very unequal, how COVID has stressed housing, how COVID has stressed our medical systems. So Chris, could you connect this moment to COVID-19 for us, the looming economic recession, and how police budgets are implicated in this?
Sure. Well, and I also would, echo Celeste and too, the officer that killed Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta had literally just taken both de-escalation training and cultural sensitivity training. So, I think whether you're talking about policy changes, whether you're talking about new equipment like body cams or training changes, there's really documented limits to what those can do and will do to limit police violence. As it relates to the coronavirus, clearly it's had a big impact on our economy and on the tax revenue that local governments rely on in order to spend, right, and invest in social services, but also in policing. And so what we see and what we're hearing right now from San Antonio officials is that they're planning on $110 million in cuts, right, to the budget because of COVID-19. And they've already frozen hiring for, and is considering furloughs for city staff, but very interestingly, not police. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. But, as was mentioned, right, all of these areas where people are hurting right now, in housing, in healthcare, and access to jobs that really enable people to stay in their housing and keep their health care. People need more services right now, not less. And what we see is that the police are taking up, and not just in San Antonio, but in city after city after city, a third or more of the local budget every single year. And so it's, the question is, where is the money going to come from? Not just to maintain the services that people rely on today, but to increase them to meet the need. And the most obvious place is the place where all the money's going already, right? It's in the police department.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Chris. Now that we've talked a little bit about why defunding has come up in this moment, how the coronavirus really helps to illustrate some of the weaknesses of our system. Now we need to talk a little bit about the role of police unions in this conversation. So we'll go ahead and transition to the topic of the police union here in San Antonio. We'll start off with Marlon. Marlon, can you contrast for the audience at home who may not know the difference between police unions and their function with the rest of the labor movement more broadly?
Sure. Thank you, Alex. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So the short answer here, as far as contrasting police and labor unions, is that police are not workers, and that in fact, the institution of policing's relationship to labor is one of conflict and suppression. Labor unions fight to secure protections for a vulnerable class of people, whereas police unions fight to secure that a class of people remain authorized to use force in maintaining the status quo, which is capitalism. And this is really how it has always been since the earliest inception of police. Our earliest model for policing was slave patrols. And so here you see there is a group of people, enslaved Africans, that was not fully empowered as a class, but exploited for their labor. And the managerial group over them was slave patrols. They monitored behavior, they kept them in proximity to the point of production. And this paradigm would remain in place as the character of America and the labor that shapes it evolved. So we see in the 1820s and 30s, as we as a nation become more urbanized and industrial, police became a professionalized force because they needed to quell labor uprisings. So you have these new factories that are unregulated and very dangerous to work at. And workers rose up against these unfair conditions and collectivized, organized together as a means of securing a safer way of providing for themselves. And in response to that movement, police became organized as a force to disrupt and suppress that movement. This happened in the 19th century with railroads. It happened in the 20s with meat packers in the Great Depression. It happened again in the 60s with the Civil Rights Movement. But what's really interesting about that is that we begin to see social organization extend beyond this idea of just labor and into a broader coalition of social justice that's predicated on anti-racist organizing. But each time, we see the unionization of police as a reaction to the unionization of labor. So after the Civil Rights Movement, we see Presidents Nixon and Reagan enact a style of governance called New Federalism that essentially strips national funding for critical infrastructure like housing and healthcare and leaves it to states to decide. And one of these infrastructures that is defunded is labor unions. But curiously enough, police unions were not, and police by extension were not. And you can verify things like this with the Land Policy Institute. I believe they just done a recent study about it. But this is really the moment where we begin to see these national services not only decline, but also the character of these city budgets where police spending is 60%, 70% of the budget overall, and police in turn take on a more militarized characteristic. And this is really where we begin to see like the beginnings, especially by the time of the 90s with the 1994 crime bill, and the utilization of SWAT against public citizens, that this is really the beginning of our modern idea of police as a hyper-militarized body that can exercise force on working class people. And moreover, you know, if we recognize, because the thing about this is that as these budgets increase, you know, there has to be some sort of justification for why we are spending so much on policing, why we're not spending so much on housing or healthcare. And when we recognize the for-profit model of things like the prison industrial complex, and also we recognize within the context of our Constitution, something like the 13th Amendment that says slavery is still legal within this context of punitive structures, then we see that policing never really changed. This is the reformed modern parallel of a slave patrol in that it protects a specialized form of for-profit exploitation that is dependent on utilizing more vulnerable populations of Black, brown, queer, poor people. So police unions really exist to protect the state's monopoly on violence, and by protecting police's basis of qualified immunity, the ability for them to sort of exercise this force without being completely halted or held accountable in that way. I'll end on this, right? Martin Luther King Jr. once said that riots are the language of the unheard. If police are the force that silences that cry, then they cannot be the voice of the people.
Well, thank you for that historic overview, Marlon. That is really going to help contextualize the next question, which is for Celeste. Conversations about policing recently have highlighted the central role of police unions in shielding corrupt and abused officers, as well as restricting funds and city budgets. Can you talk about how police unions prevent accountability and capture politics here in San Antonio?
You know, I think we could do an entire webinar on that alone. I can tell you, SAPOA, the San Antonio Police Officers Association, is one of the worst in the nation. San Antonio is at the top of national news stories for negative reasons. One of the most recent statistics that's been brought up a bit, and was just on the previous slide here, is that 70% of fired SAPD officers were rehired through arbitration between 2006 and 2017. And if we can go back to that previous slide, that would be awesome as well. And so, because I want you to see it right there, right? 2/3 of fired San Antonio police officers got their jobs back. And that includes, right, again, yet another national story. There was an officer that fed a homeless man a feces sandwich and was rehired. And then it wasn't until he had another feces related incident where he, and I'm saying this and it's graphic, but I need you to understand the type of folks that are still able to remain employed by SAPD. This man then smeared feces across the women's restroom in his police substation. And apparently that was the one that was enough for him to stay fired, but it wasn't enough previously. Outside of that, right, Robert Encina, who murdered Marquise Jones, still has his job. The officers that killed Norman Cooper still have their jobs. And, you know, San Antonio is not exempt from a lot of what you see in the Fergusons and the Minneapolis, et cetera. We have the names of folks to uplift here, but SAPOA is too busy comparing the use of the word goddamn to the N-word, or comparing Black Lives Matter to the KKK, instead of focusing on addressing the root issue, right? And so in addition to that, there are codes within our government that were created specifically to maintain power within the union. So at current, as we're talking about defunding and divestment, there's only 16% of the SAPD budget that we are even able to touch. The other, or I believe it's actually 14%. The other 86% is at the is tied into the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement between SAPOA and the city of San Antonio. And within that, that means we can only touch right now about $94 to $96 million. if we're even having the conversation about divestment. But looking at the government code 143 and 174, these codes protect and cover for bad officers and are what enables, through arbitration, the fired officers to be rehired. And basically, it ultimately makes the chief of police a figurehead. He does not maintain power. He can suggest that someone be fired, but at the end of the day, if 2/3 of officers will win their cases through arbitration, they're put back. And so beyond that, there is an entire list of officers who are not allowed to have contact with outside people. And these are officers that have to remain at desk jobs or on paperwork duty, et cetera. But those are folks that we too are paying for, right? As other areas of our budget remain funded at dismal levels. And so another way that and if we can go to the next slide, another way that SAPOA maintains power and makes good policing not even something that's possible is that it disqualifies complaints. So there's a section called Article 28, Section 19. I like to call it the red flag eraser, because what it ultimately means is that if their disciplinary action is not taken within a certain amount of time, which I believe is 180 days, then it is completely removed from the officer's record. So realistically speaking, if I am murdered by a police officer, but the SAPD is kind of dragging their feet on disciplining, if they don't do it within 180 days, then that officer's record stays clean. But even beyond that, we look at the facts that it also erases misconduct records, right? Article 28 as a whole, in the sense that between 2 to 5 years, anything that you have been disciplined on can be removed from your record. So I don't know of any job, and you all can let me know if you do, I don't know of any job in which my record would be erased just because time has passed, right? I don't know any other job where I can not only maintain my job, but get promoted even when I'm doing things that are harmful to the community in which I'm called to serve. And so, you know, you can look down this list, right? The arbitration system offers consistent loopholes for problematic officers. And the SAPOA president, Mike Helly, actually says there are no bad cops. But realistically, we are seeing that cops who otherwise had reason to be fired and removed from the force are put back on our streets, and most likely to have disciplinary infractions again. But yet another way in which unions protect folks is that it doesn't necessarily have to be communicated to another nearby department. So let's say the officer that had the feces incidents, he could go get a job in Leon Valley today, right? And they may or may not have access to the information about his most recent complaints and disciplinary actions. And so I could go on all day talking about the ways in which SAPOA, you know, is kind of one of the worst in the country. But we see it daily, right? And we see it in the lack of justice, even for the families here in San Antonio that have lost loved ones at the hands of state violence. And so you'll hear a lot of conversations in coming months, right, about what we're doing to try to repeal codes 143 and 174. But even beyond that, what we're trying to do when it comes to defunding just the $96 million that we have access to right now in the budget. So I think that's kind of the most general overview I can give about the issues with the SAPOA contract, but they definitely do not operate like a normal union, right? Because police officers still show up as police. And actually, one other thing I wanted to mention is the political capital that SAPOA has as well. SAPOA not only donates to candidates, right? Because they can only donate up to $500 for a city council member and up to $1,000 for the mayor. But it's about all of the kind of, not so under the table, but all of the in-kind donations and things like that they still give to council members. Everything from supplying breakfast tacos for neighborhood association meetings to providing hamburgers and hot dogs for National Night Out or for, you know, district events. And so when you think of how SAPOA is tied to our elected officials, it's more than just the one donation that may come directly from the union, but also from the officers themselves, because the union, you know, we don't have a way to track who is a police officer or who is a police officer's spouse in the giving, but basically the only reason that they maintain power over elected officials who would otherwise have power to push them is because of financial capital. And so we would be remiss to not acknowledge the hold that they have on city council and the mayor, even for folks who may not necessarily accept direct donations from them.
Yeah, thank you for that, Celeste. Really illustrating how the police union creates political barriers, especially for organizers and community members who want to look at defunding the police. Money that's tied up because of the union contract, or officers that are protected because of it, as well as the way that donations function to create a relationship between local elected officials and the police union. With that, we're going to talk with some people who have experience in dealing with the police union during contract negotiations. So Jonathan and Denise, you each have experience organizing around the contract. Denise, can you briefly describe what these contracts do?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. So I think Celeste did a really good job of kind of encapsulating everything that the contract does. But the contract is basically an agreement between the city of San Antonio and the police to determine, as Marlon mentioned, according to Texas state code, police officers are workers, quote unquote. And so to prevent them from going on strike, they wrote this code in to give them an opportunity to come to the table and negotiate fair wages, healthcare, that kind of thing. So this one specifically, like Celeste mentioned, is one of the worst in the country. There is a campaign with Fix SAPD to actually repeal Texas Code 143 and 174 so that we as a city have more power to negotiate this contract. If you look back to Ray Saldana's comments back in 2015, 2016, he was really the one ringing the alarm about the lack of transparency and accountability. And what the contract does is it allows certain loopholes. It kind of tips the balance to the police union to give them more power over the city in the bargaining aspect of what they can ask for. So a few things just to mention, there's many of them, but just I'll give you top three, in my opinion. It allows the contracts to overrule important public accountability. There are loopholes, such as allowing officers to avoid accountability if mistakes are made during the investigation. So a whole investigation can be essentially nulled out. And arbitrators are not accountable to the public. So when we see that 2/3 of folks getting their jobs back, the arbitrators are decided between the police union, the city, and then a third party, but they're not held accountable to the public. So that's a big issue there. And again, that collective bargaining brings them to the table. Another problematic thing is public safety in San Antonio is tied with the firefighters. So it's kind of hard to separate, it feels like if we defund the police, then we're also effectively defunding firefighters. And there's always that kind of political conversation happening. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Denise. Jonathan, can you share some of the conflicts and lessons learned from the previous fight over the contract?
Yes. Again, thank you everybody for being here. Wow. I mean, everybody's done such a good job of just encapsulating just all the rhetoric and all the legal rhetoric behind the contracts. And I just kind of want to share really just organically my experience organizing with Mike Lowe around the contract back when it was in discussion before, specifically with the union president. So I actually was called in for a private meeting with Mike Kelly, who I believe he's still the current president, but I think he recently resigned and he's on his way out. But I just want to drive home just how serious and in my opinion, dangerous these collective bargaining agreement meetings can go. So in my private meeting with Mike Kelly, the first thing I noted was he's telling me these stories about different officers and different engagements his officers have had. While he's telling me this story, knowing that at the time I'm Jonathan David Jones, one of the prominent less thugs and hoes. So that was the first thing that just kind of like surprised me, because this is the president of the police union, the one who draws up these contracts and things like that, who has so much influence on the political direction when it comes to police accountability. And I was in a meeting with him for 3 hours, and all 3 hours were spent on him trying to convince me why his contract was a good thing. And he wanted me to go back and tell the community that it was so as well. But there was never once any mention of the public and the people and the impact that it had on them. Every single sentence he gave me was all about protecting officers. And I remember I specifically asked him about the in the contract where it was talking about removing records for intentional violence for police officers. And his response was, well, what I don't want is an officer to be on the force for 15 years and he does something in his first 2 years and then he gets in trouble for it 10 years later. That raises a huge alarm to me because first, when you see these men that are being murdered by police, and not even just black men, but black people being murdered by police, the first thing we hear about is what they did in their past, going way back to high school and how violent they may not have been. But the biggest concern was just the issue of, it was just protection for the police, the entire conversation. So that was a big concern for me when I was organizing back then, where I really realized these people literally, they don't care about the people. The union officers or even the union president, he has no interest whatsoever in the interest of the public. And it's all about protecting his officers. And that just raises a big problem as well, because he's in private meetings with the mayor. And we have no idea how those conversations goes. But one thing that did lead me to believe how they could go was Mayor Ivy Taylor at the time, who they had gotten together and talked about this contract, and they decided on what they wanted these articles to say. Then when we were organizing at City Hall and things like that, Mayor Ivy Taylor then actually went back to Mike Kelly and presented some of the concerns that we raised. And she came back and just slashed it all. And her response was pretty much, we're just tired of fighting with the union. And so the way I took that was Mike Kelly and the police union quite literally bullied their way into getting their contract passed. And that was kind of the experience I felt surrounding how the contract got passed the first time a few years ago. It was that the police union quite literally was able to bully their way into power over the city. And so as far as experience as an organizer, and I would just leave with this, I've seen everybody do such a good job around organizing right now whatsoever. My meeting with Mike Kelly was signed that there is no middle ground with them. It is yes or no. And that's the same way that they handle these contracts as well. So it's either for the people or for the police. And you have to be very intentional. And as Celeste said, reform has to go out the window. You can't reform something that's doing exactly what they want it to do.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jonathan. I think it's really important for folks to know the kind of agency, the kind of institution that they're dealing with when wanting to have this kind of fight about defunding the police so that we can get better social safety nets, so that we can get housing. You know, big barrier to all of that, to getting that better transit, to getting those better jobs, that funding for those services is that union. You can go ahead and switch to the next slide. This is just an illustration of the way that this institution thinks. This is a direct quote from the president that's being talked about. And I want to give the floor to Marlon really quickly. Marlon, if you'd like to make a comment about this.
Yes, so very quickly, I just, this comment always kind of raises an eyebrow for me because it's just so far removed from reality. The KKK was founded in the 1860s, so by the point of this quote, it had already existed for 100 years at least. And Birth of a Nation, the film that revived and emboldened the KKK to take public racist action, was screened at the White House with Woodrow Wilson about 40 years prior to that. So it's this idea that you're protesting an authority that's actually, in fact, aligned with some of the values that you're espousing, right? And more so, this idea of this tactic of equating the KKK and the civil rights movement, for example, because that was the real social unrest of this moment, I think is dishonest, but also important because in doing this, he is really speaking to the true function of police, which is not to address crime, but to maintain social order. So by equating civil rights with racist unrest, he plainly models the way that police unions appropriate the spirit of labor unions, this sort of sense of protectionism for a common or vulnerable class of people's good, and really sort of misapplies it to this actual function of suppression and social control. And that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you for unpacking why that quote is so ludicrous, Marlon, but nevertheless, that's what we're dealing with. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide. This is just another example of the political posture of the union. And I want to give the floor to Caro Canizales to take us through this billboard.
I just want to say thank you, Marlon, for bringing in the real talk and all of our panelists about, the union and how they're a political group that's, actively against Black folks, brown folks in our city. And this is just one example. They ran a billboard campaign, cost thousands of dollars of taxpayer dollars, to basically vilify, Black immigrants, brown immigrants, Muslim immigrants, that live in our city. And they use this type of narrative tactic, right, to create fear of immigrants, undocumented folks that live in our city, so that then they can justify later criminalizing them. And it happens with every of the groups. So just pay attention and challenge, this type of propaganda, because it only leads to more funding for them, and it only leads to more polarization in our communities, where they have to believe that undocumented immigrants are no good and we must be protected from them by the police, using the police. So just FYI on how they use these tactics and their power.
Thank you, Caro, for that background on this billboard and talking a little bit about how propaganda is used to support the union. Next, we're going to move to opportunities for divestment from policing. So now that we understand how the union plays a role, we understand why defund came up now. What about in San Antonio? So if we can move to the next slide to talk about divestment. We'll start with Marlon. Marlon, can you walk us through the COSA budget? Can you walk us through how the COSA budget, like other municipal budget, breaks down in a way that underfunds social programs and overfunds the police?
Of course. So I think for it to begin, I think most people have a working idea of how budgets actually function. And so it's not too hard to imagine how a graph like this that we're looking at sort of plays out in our day-to-day lives. But the simplest way of saying it is that you can't spend the same dollar twice. So when we have, $479 million devoted to this concept of public safety, but only 52.4 million, for example, being split between these very three critical functions of housing, health, and human services, what we're doing here is essentially inventing inequality. And when you couple that with research, for instance, what's common knowledge, but also research that's verified by like NYU's Public School of Health, that poor neighborhoods, which are predominantly Black and brown, are over-policed, we see that we're setting ourselves up for a system of organized abandonment, where Black and brown populations are first going to be abandoned by virtue of not receiving the city funds that they need to live and succeed, but then also be punished by that lack of funds by virtue of the policing of poverty and the criminalization that kind of enacts upon a community. So this really sets us up to fail. But beyond that, this sort of budget also justifies further defunding of social programs. For example, if there were a pilot program about a housing first model that might, attempt to address homelessness by providing them with a home and the resources to provide for themselves, and that does not receive enough money per, this budget model, that becomes an empirical basis that cities can point to and say, well, we actually shouldn't invest in these sorts of programs because they don't work, when in actuality, they were never funded adequately enough to work on the first place. And that goes for housing, education, healthcare, and all that more so within the context of a global pandemic. I would encourage folks when they see this budget to think of it not just as a distribution of finances, but also the actual social construction of inequality. This is what it looks like to create that within our lives.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Marlon. Next, we're going to go to Chris. Chris, how could different budget apportionments produce public safety that's not anchored in policing? And then I know you work statewide on issues like this. So can you give us examples of whether or not this fits a pattern of other budgets in cities in Texas, and whether or not their spending breakdowns really look the same way?
Sure thing. If you don't mind going to the next slide. And thank you for that question, Alex. And that set up Marlon. I think that really captured it well. We did some analysis looking back over the police budget here in the whole city budget here in San Antonio going back to 2016. And exactly to Marlon's point. So here you see for every dollar San Antonio spent on policing over the last 5 years, it spent 2 cents on housing. It spent 3 cents on health. It spent 11 cents on parks, 9 cents on libraries, and 2 cents on youth programming. So this is this is inequality baked into your budget, into the document that's supposed to encompass the sort of moral coda that your city follows. And unfortunately, to answer your question, it's extremely similar picture when we look around the state, particularly at other big cities. And for many of the same factors. While I agree the association that represents officers in San Antonio is clearly one of the worst, it's unfortunate that there are similarly positioned and powerful associations representing police in all of the major cities that wield political power, as well as at the state level, to ensure protection of funding towards officers. So, to the points earlier about how the union contract really limits what San Antonio can do, it's actually worse here than in some places, because not only does it provide for a lot of pay and benefits and additional bonuses and things to officers, the San Antonio contract, somewhat uniquely in Texas at least, limits the ability of the city to perform layoffs. It controls how those layoffs, if they were to be undertaken, could be done, limiting them to doing it on the basis of seniority. So for instance, if you wanted to do layoffs, one, you'd have to prove that there was a lack of work for officers according to the contract, which is an additional level of control that you don't see in other city contracts. And then if you were to actually prove that, you can only start laying officers off on the basis of the most new, who are also the cheapest, the least paid among them. So there are a lot of restrictions that are put in place in San Antonio, especially to defunding. And so I think the work that's being done here around the agreement between the police association and the city is really important and going to be critical to long-term divestment from the department. And yes, please, Celeste, chime in.
I just wanted to add in one point that I like to bring up in meetings where we're having to talk with some of the elected officials that just don't seem to understand what divestment means. And if you look at, the housing, health, parks, libraries, youth programming, what I tell them is these are the things that if we invested a bit more in, our communities would not be criminalized. Right? There would be the less need for officers, as you're saying, right? We would need to prove that there's not a need for them. But we can't do that if we're not adequately funding wraparound services that create a community that can thrive without over-policing. And so I just wanted to flag that to what you said. And as something that I'm sorry, I'm speaking too quickly, as something that I try to bring up whenever I can is that the very things that are leading our communities to be over-criminalized are funded at dismal levels. And so I just wanted to flag here that this graphic really throws me off. And it's something I think that, folks think that they're not for defunding until they see something like this, and it makes me think of too, the common saying amongst organizers in the work, right, is that if you want to see what a community without police looks like, look at the suburbs where there are, access to housing. There are good parks, great libraries, great education. So I just wanted to add that in there to your point.
Yeah, thank you for that, Celeste. I think it brings up the comment that was on one of the slides earlier that, the scholar Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor says policing is the public policy of last resort. That rather than develop programs, rather than invest in community, we invest in police, and it's really a failure of imagination. And those two are intimately interrelated with one another. The conditions that produce desperation and produce suffering are the justifications to criminalize. And if we treated root causes rather than symptoms, we wouldn't see the abuse that we see. So I really, really appreciate that insight.
If you could go to the next slide, there's just a couple more here to really quickly talk through. I mean, if you look at, again, 2016 and 2020, the data is very skewed. So, but if you look at 2016 to 2019, we see the continuation of the trend I spoke of earlier, right? Even the faulty notion of crime that that we operate under, which is very much largely based on poverty and other things. We've seen the crime rate drop 22% since 2016. We've seen the arrest rate, so the actual arrest that officers are undertaking, drop at 29% since 2016. But we only see the police spending per capita, so basically the police spending rate, it's dropped actually a little bit less than 1%. So police continually create a new way to be used, to continue to create busy work for themselves and insert themselves in things, even where it's their stated purpose, their stated goal, the reason they're supposed to exist goes away or reduces. Somehow their number and their budgets don't reduce in the same way. And if we look at one more slide down, what we did was, I'm sorry, if you could go to the next slide. We looked at some of the most immediate police budget saving opportunities. There are definitely more, but these are some that we wanted to highlight as potential opportunities in the short term for the budget cycle. As I mentioned earlier, there is they're hiring freeze for city staff, potential furloughs. This doesn't apply to the police. If we look at if the city were to institute something along the lines of a hiring freeze for police, you can see the potential savings here. And there's a little bit of information about how we came up with that number. In addition, things like overtime, we put out some of the seemingly more extraneous other expenses in terms of surveillance and electronics and furniture. And so these are things that seemingly could happen in this budget cycle and should happen in this budget cycle to help reduce it. But it very much relies on also reducing our, the reliance on police, right? Putting in place alternatives where they're needed, and then also saying we're not going to answer these problems with police anymore, so that we can actually start to do this. And I believe Marlon had a comment, so I'll see it here.
Yes, thank you, Chris. And very quickly, I just wanted to add that part of the reason why we can't get further in depth here is because we are still awaiting a disaggregated line item budget from the police outlining what the budget specifics look like. And despite numerous attempts to file a Freedom of Information Act request to receive that, where we're stalled is that these same requests are actually processed by the police department. So there's every incentive for them to drag their feet in sort of providing us that kind of information, particularly ahead of a budget schedule that begins conversations in August. And I believe our friend Celeste has something else that she would like to add here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that according to city officials, they think they have now given us the disaggregated line item budget. And I want to make this very clear. For $479 million, it is a 6-page document. And it is like a 6-page document that seems to be a Microsoft Word table of spending. And I don't know a single company or organization that could get away with describing their budget of $479 million in a 6-page document. So to Marlon's point, we haven't received a truly disaggregated budget, but the city at current thinks that they have given us that, and they said that this is what they have. And I mentioned, they have areas that say ammunition, community policing, right? Like it's not even broken down within the language they're using. And we will not stop until we see every cheese puff purchased, every can of Rogaine, you name it. But I wanted to mention there that we have not received a disaggregated line item budget, but according to the elected officials that responded because they saw me tweet to them about this. They said that this is a disaggregate line item budget that they were handed. And so in our call to action later, there will be an opportunity to urge you to join me in applying public pressure to get the real disaggregate budget. So I wanted to just flag that in their minds, they think they've given it to us already, but they very clearly have not.
Yeah, thank you for that, Celeste. In order for folks to evaluate just how much money is available to be cut immediately, to see what police are doing, we need information, and it's not fair that that's being unilaterally withheld from us as the taxpaying public, as members of the community. And so certainly that's important to stress. And just before we exit this section, I want to say thanks to the folks at Texas Appleseed and Chris for pulling some of these numbers to give suggestions of what could be cut immediately. And just to close the section out, Marlon, could you just let everybody know so that it's crystal clear on the webinar just how much money could be cut at this moment that isn't bound up in the contract?
Yes, so very quickly, as of right now, the CBA only allows us to touch about 18% of the overall budget for policing, which roughly translates to about $96 million. So while that's, only a fraction of the overall $479 million amount, that alone, that number in itself is still more than what we're putting towards healthcare, housing, and human services. And even there, the $54 billion that we're investing, we're splitting 3 ways at least. So there's a lot to be gained from taking action now, especially action that, as we've seen from the national headlines via the food bank or the national headlines of San Antonio's overtaxed healthcare system, these are critical infrastructures that need funding right now.
Yeah, thank you for making that very clear for everybody, Marlon, and talking about some of the instability in our city as a result of so much money being hemorrhaged in policing. Next, we're going to move to a really critical part of this conversation. I think we can walk through some of the ways in which police have been murderous, some of the ways in which police have been abusive, some of the ways in which the union that protects them has been racist and derogatory and bigoted in its language. But that's really the position that's critical, and it's really hard for folks to imagine alternatives to police. And so a critical aspect of this conversation is, should we be able to defund the police, we need to also envision alternative health and safety systems. So on that note, if you could switch to the next slide. Next slide. Cool. Here's a quote from Miriam Kava that I think really neatly encapsulates this sentiment. And so Celeste, part of the conversation around defunding the police asked the public to reimagine safety. What are some examples of non-police programs around the country that produce safety? What are some of the ideas that you've seen?
Thank you. So one thing, I guess I'll start with the thing that I'm hearing the most that I personally don't necessarily agree is our best mode of action. Folks are like, send social workers instead of police officers. And one thing that troubles me there is, A, social workers are already spread incredibly thin within the work that they do. And B, social work, especially when it comes to child protective services and other areas, isn't always necessarily ethical in their practices as well, right? And necessarily, I love and appreciate social workers, but we need to be mindful that we are not going from one broken system to another. And for my friends that are social workers that are working 60+ hours a week, are spread thin with extremely high caseloads, not making necessarily the most livable of wages. I would say that is an area of concern that I have when it comes to folks, the first thing they're saying being social workers. But I think safety looks like access to healthcare, access to mental health, right? The space in which you could call a dispute resolution professional, versus someone armed with a gun, or have unarmed traffic patrols versus folks armed with guns, right? I think it's also just this heavy militarization of police that they're bringing guns to a water balloon fight, basically, right? And I think that there are a lot of ways in which we could do that. And and just like as Miriam Kaba has said here, right? Like once you've provided healthcare, access to housing, education, and good jobs, there's no need to over criminalize or criminalize our communities at all. Right. And, you know, right now too, we see cops being called to address homelessness. And frankly, it's incredibly dangerous, right? For starters, number one. But number two, it's also, what are we doing to actually develop the sense of community care and mutual aid? And those are things right now that we don't have. So in a world, you know, where I believe that another world is possible, what I see in that world is a sense of community care and like holistic wellness, and leveraging professionals that have the space, right? And creating a space in which we are investing in services that really strengthen our community to begin with. You know, and we see all of these like after the fact things that are added in as Band-Aids, right? One example is, you know, you see like second chance initiatives and things like that. But what if we didn't have to get to the second chance, right? What if we didn't have to get to the space where Black and brown folks are being overly criminalized and put into jail, et cetera, et cetera. And so I know I started off on a kind of like weird note, right? Saying the thing I don't like that I hear the most, but I do want us to be mindful of the fact that we have the space, and this is a conversation, right? Divestment and defunding is not a new conversation, especially as a means toward abolition. There have been abolitionists, right, doing this work long before any of us on this call were in existence. And so the framework for what this can look like is there. It's just a matter of literally just investing in the things that help communities thrive, right? We're still not at a space where folks have, you know, even if you're not homeless, right, we still are not at a place where folks have access to livable wages, where folks have access to education, you know, where folks have access to healthcare. And so I think it really is that simple. I wish I could say, oh, you need to create this robust new system of community policing. But again, as Miriam Kaba says, like we would not need police in the first place if we just invested where it matters most. But I would, you know, to bring it full circle, I would like to urge folks to not put more, or not just like volunteer social workers without speaking to social workers. And I think that's one thing that we're doing and having important communications in now, right, is trying to identify folks that work in the fields that otherwise could pick up the slack, or take, you know, things off of SAPD's plate, to make sure that the folks that do the work that we would need done are in the room and have a say in what that looks like.
Yeah, thank you for that, Celeste. Really appreciate that overview. Next, we're going to go to Catalina. Catalina, the police are expensive. Oftentimes, cities have to pay for lawsuits. They have to service their benefits under police contracts. All these factors cost cities money, and it's part of the reason why we do see such large budgets. What about the economics of public safety alternatives? Are they cheaper? What does this look like?
Yes. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Celeste, for framing, you know, what does it look like to create alternatives and how not one community needs to carry a burden of creating such alternatives. So if we can go to the next slide real quickly. Thank you. I wanted to share actually 2 examples where community has stepped up, you know, to protect each other and redefine what well-being and safety means for them. And these programs are actually way cheaper or free than like the billions of dollars and millions of dollars that are going into police budget. And one more thing is, I also think that our community members, right, our neighbors have the skills, you know, to watch out for each other, but we've normalized delegating such skills to police. I mean, how many people know a neighbor that calls the police for a simple noise complaint? What happened to us being able to knock on the door of our neighbor to tell them that, right? Or ask them kindly to do something. Also traffic stops, like Celeste said. You know, it's like, why do we need like an armed person behind our car stopping us, right? It's like, it's like all this delegation of normal like social interactions have landed you know, as a responsibility of the police. And I think we need to challenge ourselves and like, you know, if we get into a car accident, don't call the police, just exchange the insurance information, right? Don't create an unsafe situation when, you know, for other folks. So, you know, just little things that you can start doing on your daily life. I want to first talk about CAHOOTS, so which is a crisis assistant helping out in the streets. These are actually community members that have some type of, you know, mental health experience on them that have signed up to respond to crisis in their neighborhoods. This is a model that has worked for 30 years in a city in Oregon, Eugene. And, you know, it cost them $800,000 to run it. Whereas, you know, their police department has $58 million. And when you see, you know, the disparity in expenses, we could probably think of this, you know, being in our neighborhoods here in San Antonio and how we can get volunteers to do, that have some of the skills, you know, already and invest in them so that they can help us create a neighborhood in which we all feel safe. I also think that, quick example, I know we're running out of time, but you know, the volunteer block watch, you know, in Chicago, it's free. And these are all volunteers that love their neighborhood and love the businesses in their neighborhood. And they've been able to organize a network of community members and neighbors that watch over 50 blocks. And a lot of those 50 blocks have business quarters for their communities. So they have their own network, you know, they use texting apps and they respond, and they've been trained on the escalation. They know each other. They're not armed. They use walkie-talkies, right? Like, and it's been a beautiful sort of like organized communities that have found alternatives that are, you know, free sometimes and sometimes very low resourced, and has kept people safer, right? So just two really quick examples. Feel free to Google them and learn more about them, but definitely would love to think, you know, with all of you, how do we even start creating those things in our neighborhoods, you know, for San Antonio?
Thank you so much, Carolina. It's really helpful for folks who may be new to this conversation, who may be uninitiated, to, you know, trying to reimagine public safety, draw the connection between overspending on police and underspending in social services, that if we actually did get to a place where we're not relying on police for these kinds of community needs, you know, what could that look like? So examples really, really help folks. Appreciate you walking through some of those. Next, we're gonna jump to how you can make a difference here locally in the budget. So I'm gonna hand it over actually to Denise and to Marlon to talk a little bit about the budget cycle, how that all operates, and how folks can plug in.
Okay, great. I can go first if we can go to the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So you already saw this pie graph before, but I wanted to highlight this, and I want to restate that budgets are moral documents, exactly what Marlon and Celeste and everyone else really have been saying, that, you know, you spend money where you want to spend money. And I feel like the city has not invested enough money, I think we can all agree, in housing and healthcare and things that will benefit our community the most, so that we're not over criminalized. So I saw the little penny diagram, but I just wanted to give you a few dollar amounts here. That police and fire budget make up 64.3% of the budget. Streets and infrastructure like sidewalks, drainage, etc. And we know parts on our underserved communities have not seen street or sidewalk maintenance in a very long time, is only 113 million. And just for background, a street or a sidewalk can cost anywhere. Typically a street reconstruction costs $1 million. So imagine how many streets are getting done with that money. Parks are only getting 52 million, and all of their departments, including the library, human services, which includes homeless outreach, animal care, housing, and health, share a total of $290.6 million. So when we're discussing the budget right now, council is actually in budget discussions. If we can go to the next slide, please, so I can show the calendar. The next one after that, I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, so budget discussions actually began sometime in March to begin for the fiscal year. So I do want to highlight that because of COVID, the city, I believe, has lost close to $20 million in revenue because a lot of that revenue comes from the hotel occupancy tax and other tourism. So we know that's been affected by COVID. So we've lost a big chunk. And I think a good point to make here is when you call your elected officials. I think I put a link in the chat of how you can find your city council member. When you call them, I would emphasize we're in the middle of a pandemic. And I think, as again, if a budget is a moral document, we need to fund people where they are. This means direct assistance to people. We are going to be facing a huge eviction crisis. At the end of this week, actually, on the 24th, the CARES Act will completely the rent moratorium will be over. And so that means evictions can begin as soon as the end of August. And so I think we need to be clear that we're facing a big housing crisis already, and the pandemic is now going to exacerbate that. I'm going to say times 100, times 1,000. So I think now is really the time to pressure our elected officials and the city managers who ultimately make this decision and the budget that we want our money to go to our communities directly, especially right now, especially in this time. So in this calendar here, you can see I put a red arrow for Friday, June 26th, which will be this week. And this is going to be a special session that you can watch at sanantonio.gov/TVSA. They're going to have a work session in August. A couple of those actually, and then community input will begin August 17th to Monday, August 31st. If I can go back to the slide previous to this. Thank you. I just want to show that, you know, we still need to demand a disaggregated line item police budget like Celeste and Marlon have mentioned. Again, demand funds go directly to the community. And then while I don't agree that the SA Speak Up I guess survey is the best method for retaining public input, this is what the city goes off of. So I ask that you take this survey, that you share this survey with everybody you know, and ask to reduce the public safety section, and give recommendations where you want it to go, housing, health, etc. Also, again, message, email, call your public officials. I'll just say from experience that emails kind of, you read them, you see them, okay, whatever, but phone calls definitely are heard. So please call. I just included some other data here so you can understand. If you go on to sanantonio.gov, there have been previously recorded meetings of the police budget, what that looks like, where they plan on spending that money and how they defend that. So I just wanted to give you this piece. On a second note, I know we were mentioning earlier, police are some of the most expensive workers in the city. So they're paid some of the highest salaries than any other city worker in the city of San Antonio. They also get special treatment. So while a majority of SAPD officers do not live in the San Antonio area, the city will give them actually help for a down payment on a house to live in the city. So where is this money going? I mean, I'm sure there's other little things that we can uncover if we really get that budget. And I think it's important that we do. And a second thing, I just wanted to say on a personal note, so my father was actually an SAPD detective. He was an officer for over, I want to say 25 years. He wasn't in my life for all of that time. But I remember one time when I did meet him, I was surprised to discover that I had been on his health insurance plan since I was born. And I was about 20 years old. So how long had the city been paying for my health insurance for a father I never interacted with? So I just want y'all to keep this in the back of the mind. How much are we paying? Too much money that can be going back to our communities. So I think that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Denise. That was a really great overview. And I think to also kind of compound a lot of the really great points that she mentioned there, it's that unemployment and the weekly $600 is going to be ended, I believe, at the end of next week or this week. So that's going to really coincide and kind of magnify the housing crisis that we're expected to face here. If we want to move, can we move to the next slide? And there we go, great. So as you have heard today, and as I hope you take away, the understanding that it's going to take all of our collective talents, all of our organizers and activists and cultural workers, artists, people that maybe even never considered themselves to be an organizer or an quote unquote activist, to reimagine and bring light to life the San Antonio of our dreams. And this is really, in actuality, a huge exercise of imagination that maybe we have never really sort of had before. Because what we're doing now in this moment is attempting to pivot from this simple cry of defunding the police and moving towards now, what are we for? What are we investing in? As we choose to invest in one another, what are the specifics and logistics of these programs? For example, what does it take to create hospital beds? If schools have to opt for a social distance model in the fall, what does it take to maybe fund school lunches so that these kids and families that depended on that steady meal can still have that same support, in a social distance capacity? These are the questions that we have to begin asking ourselves and that we have to be accountable to in this process, and showing up for one another to create an economy of care. And I've realized that for a lot of people, and myself included, this can feel somewhat frightening. But I would encourage you to take that same fear and find it a galvanization, in that for once you're becoming the architect of your own world and your own reality, and you're not doing it in isolation, but with collective action from other people who are also vulnerable, who are also ready and willing to put everything on the line, and creating a future that is actually equitable and democratic for our most vulnerable and most disadvantaged members of society. So with that being said, we're going to move forward to the next slide to talk about a couple of other places you can plug in. As of right now, you can sign up now to work alongside students, parents, and community to organize around school policing. There are several efforts that are going around, and there should be a link provided to you here in the chat. And this is a movement that is led by students, by people, children, but people who have grown up within the system and so can speak directly to the effects of what it has meant to them to have policing in these institutions of education, and how they would like to best see that remedied moving forward for the next generation. Beyond that, on Saturday, there's going to be an action on July 25th at noon. It's called Which Side Are You On? And it's a caravan and food drive link, which I believe it's organized or headlined specifically by PSL, Party for Socialism and Liberation. And this is going to be, as we've said before, the food bank has made national headlines. We've seen a lot of people living on the edge of precarity. And so this is the beginnings of a mutual aid effort that we're hoping to launch to sustain one another until we can find or utilize the structural channels for a more long-standing, sustainable effort. Next page, please. On August 1st, there's a National Day of Action in solidarity with organizers across the nation in a caravan for Black Lives. The location is to be determined, but it will take place at about 11 a.m. We're looking at a couple of different specific stadium lots, places that can accommodate large amounts of people. And we're also in talks to develop what it would mean to have a rally for this sort of kind of disjointed social interaction. So the car caravan is because we're trying to acknowledge the social distance measures. We want to be considerate of everyone and our immunocompromised friends. We want everyone to be able to participate while also protecting themselves. But that will be taking place on August 1st. And so we do encourage you to sign up and remain on top of that. Beyond that, you can also get involved with the defund movement as a whole. There's going to be a link that I'll drop to our website here. And there's a Google form at the bottom of the page that you can fill out to sign up as a volunteer, or just sign up to receive more information about things. If you want to kind of stay abreast of information as it develops and as the situation kind of plays out before us. I will say we are hoping to launch a web tool within the coming days. And it's something that I think would be very useful for folks as they begin to imagine what it would mean to defund the police. And to that point, I know that we've spoken very broadly in terms of imagination and kind of reaching towards the future and what that could look like to create a model of public safety that is more preventative and incorporating these economies of care for our communities. But I just want to reassure folks that there's actually been research done that sustains these ideas. Specifically, my most favorite one to reference is a woman named Eleanor Ostrom. And in 2009, she won the Nobel Peace Prize for Economic Policy, predicated on her work, which it says, for the commons. And this was built on decades of study since the 1970s about how decentralizing police, defunding police is actually a model that not only works towards public safety, but in fact makes people happier. Because what you do when you decentralize this central force, as we've just said before, police, are in charge of processing the Freedom of Information Act. So when you decentralize that, you free your city and your public services from this element of force or militarized bureaucracy, and it creates a new way of people being able to participate and govern their own lives and existence. So we say all that to say that a better world is possible. We are not the first minds to have this conversation, and you are not the first people to maybe feel these same frustrations, but we can be the first to change it. And I'm excited to see that happen with the people in this room and the people on this call and the people in our communities back home. So thank you all for being here. Alex, I think, are we going to move to question and answer?
Yes, thank you so much for ending us on such a strong and visionary note, giving folks a place that they can get involved locally. This fight is local and global. Thanks for making that so clear, Marlon. The first question we've got, and I'm just going to throw this out to the entire panel because I think that anybody who feels comfortable answering can answer. Who is benefiting from purchasing of militarized equipment? We see local police departments use this during riots when they service no-knock warrants. Militarization of police just makes police more dangerous. I think that's been really stark since Ferguson, but we're really seeing it on display now. So who benefits financially when you see this gear out in public?
Well, I can say not to the financial end, but who benefits is white supremacy, right? Like ultimately, the level of fear that it incites in community, and the lack of trust that it then continues to perpetuate of folks that are in spaces of authority. Yeah.
I can also say very quickly that San Antonio is also known as Military City USA. And to that point, the military needs a sense of manufacturing, it needs a sense of supply. And so when you can expand that supply line to the police, it further legitimizes both institutions, not only in form, but also in a financial capacity. So it's a system that kind of legitimizes itself. It's like kind of like a snake eating its own tail, like it proves it exists because it creates its existence. Weird.
I want to mention as well from some data we received that the last time SAPD received non-weaponry equipment through this program was in 2017. SAPD's participation in this program is set to expire in September 30th of this year. So I think that's another point to pressure your elected officials on, is that you do not want this contract. It's called the 1033 program, where they're receiving funds, I believe they're federal funds, for militarization of the police. So that's another point to put in your messaging, that you do not want this to be re-upped after September 30th of 2020.
Yeah, and I just had, who benefits is the private military contractors and arms manufacturers. Programs like 1033 allow the U.S. military to pawn off their older equipment, really helping them justify new purchases of military equipment from those manufacturers, while also obviously militarizing our local police departments. And while they often receive that military equipment for free or extremely cheap from the military, it doesn't come without costs, not just in cost to people's lives, right, when they use that equipment on all of us, but because it takes money to work and keep a helicopter running. It takes money to train people to use a helicopter or an MRAP, which is like a small tank. These things don't actually come for free, and so it is a part of the defund movement to push to cut off these military equipment transfers.
Can I also add to, just very quickly, that I saw something that said if this country provided healthcare and free education, who would join the military? Because that's so often how many people gain access to the military, because they need their basic needs met. I would say similarly, just being a San Antonian and knowing folks that I grew up with in a lower economic status who later became police officers, that I see a similar trend in our police officers. They're making $55,000 on average with a high school diploma. So in San Antonio, honestly, if that were me, without my needs being met, that's a pretty good job. You get your health care, you get paid pretty well, you're getting paid more than teachers in most cases. I think that should go also into the conversation of when we meet these needs of folks with education, with healthcare, with their basic needs, that maybe they don't want to become the cops after all, right? So I think that's just something to think about.
Yeah, thank you all for a really comprehensive response to that audience member's question. There's another question on here and a lot of questions that were in the Facebook stream, a lot of comments related to this. And I want to direct this to Celeste. This is about how folks can put pressure on local officials to get us that disaggregated line item budget that we need in order to make these critical assessments of how we overspend, where we overspend, what kind of programs we don't need. So how can we put pressure on folks?
Yeah, I volunteered to answer that question because my mom is who put it in the Facebook chat. So hi, Mom. But there are a few ways, right, in which we can engage. So the easiest and quickest is to blow up elected officials' Facebook pages, Twitter, their phone lines, their emails. As we mentioned at the beginning of the call, once you are sent resources, we will include all of the contact information for your elected officials. And that is one way, but the best way and the way that we're gearing up for now is the public input sessions on the proposed budget, right, that are upcoming in August. So on August 6th, City Council is going to be presented with the proposed budget that the city staff has created. And we are going to need to rise like hell to use our voices there and share how can you create a budget if you haven't been transparent with the community on what your spending looks like, right? Realistically, there's this famed sense of engagement that the city government is known for, right? Where they have a few events for public input sessions sprinkled here throughout that are typically right after work around the 6 p.m. time. And they kind of do like 4 or 5 of them. And some of them are in areas which are hard to reach with traffic. So they're not necessarily accessible to folks that work either multiple jobs or folks that work anything other than a 9 to 5. And then when you go, you're kind of spoken at, and there's not really a lot of space for direct dialogue. So the one space where you can go to make sure that your voice is heard and that you are the one speaking to City Council is going to be at these public input sessions and the public budget hearings. And so please continue to, you can follow, I think all of our organizations will share this information, but if you follow Black Futures Collective on Instagram, we'll be posting as well about like dates in which you can engage here and show up with us to City Council and speak to the need for divestment, the need for defunding, and why it cannot wait. And also show up to these other events that, like I said, though they create this famed sense of community involvement, it's still worth showing up. And I will say that, right, it's still worth showing up because I think we are the folks that are not necessarily expected to show up. And I can say this, right, for transparency, I used to work for City Council District 2, and I saw then that most of the people that attended these SA Speak Up events were people that are like neighborhood association leaders or maybe older. Like there's not a true representation of what San Antonio's population looks like there. So we need to show up to these events. And if you are unable to show up or are immunocompromised, there will be digital options, at least for the SA Speak Up events. I'm not sure about what the city's going to do about City Council meetings, but outside of that, please blow them up on social media. I have been tweeting every day like, hello, where's the disaggregate line item budget? And public pressure is elected officials' favorite. It's the thing to get them to act fastest. So those are kind of ways to stay engaged and apply that pressure there, because as Marlon mentioned earlier, growing power in the sense of a collective is so important here, right? Where it's like people power, there's nothing in the world like people power. And so people power is created by all of us sharing a message together and moving forward that way. So that is kind of a long-winded way to just say, come with us to all of the meetings.
Thank you, Celeste. Really appreciate that way of getting involved. Building people power is certainly, a lot of folks out there want to do that and they just don't know the first step. So thanks for helping them figure out what that first step is. A lot of folks are also asking, and I want to direct this question to Chris. A lot of folks are also asking on the stream if we have any plans to communicate after this webinar is over. Can we send out an email that includes educational information? So how will the folks on this call follow up with the folks watching at home?
Sure, yeah, so I'm pretty sure that we are recording this, so we'll have both a recording that we can make available as well as transcripts of this session, I believe in both English and Spanish, that we can post online on our Facebook, and hopefully all of the various groups participating in this will post as well. I think that once we get a disaggregated line item budget, our intention at Texas Appleseed is to go through it and to put together more information about opportunities for both in the short and mid and long term for cuts to the police department budget and how we can go about doing that. Is there more to that question, or is that a good response for now?
I think that suffices. We'll definitely let folks know, and they heard from you that they'll be communicated with after the fact. So really appreciate that very much. Really interesting question here. It really gets to the heart of, do police produce safety? It's talking about how San Antonio is one of the most dangerous cities for women. And if that's the case, if police are supposed to produce safety, and it's so unsafe for women, what are we paying them for? And so I know the subject of domestic violence, of intimate partner violence is a very sensitive subject, but if somebody could speak to, the lack of safety for women in the city of San Antonio.
I feel like I've talked a lot, but I just want to add, yes, we did a survey, the city of San Antonio did a survey about the what is it called? The status of women, and so it gave some really harrowing details of how many women are abused. And I do want to highlight too that police are some of the most open domestic violence abusers anywhere in the country, really. There is even a case, if you look on KSAT with their Broken Blue, where there was an officer who actually beat up his girlfriend, and then he was given his job back, despite very clearly beating her in the face with a rock, I think is what I heard yesterday. He beat her in the face with a rock. So, I mean, how are we expecting these people to protect the community when a lot of them are often the folks perpetuating this violence, especially against women? It's misogyny. I think in the story that Celeste mentioned with the cop who spread feces, the incident was only reported because he spread feces in the bathroom, and a female cop, actually, it made her physically sick, and she was the one who reported it, and that's kind of what happened. So how much are these cops doing to women? It'd be interesting to even ask female cops, like, what do they go through? But I think despite this, San Antonio, we, as a woman in San Antonio who has had many generations of women in San Antonio, we're often the last considered, especially Black women, especially Black trans women. And so, I mean, I think there's something to be said. I'll put the link in the chat of that Status of Women report, because the stats are really, really sad.
Yeah, I think to just sort of build on what Denise has really skillfully shared with us is that, if policing was this thing, this novel solution that could eliminate crime, then crime in itself would, decrease as police budgets increase, and they seemingly or presumably gain the skills and the tools that they need to combat that. However, when you do like a cross comparative of, the National Reserve's information about municipal budgets for policing, as well as the Department of Justice's statistics about crime since the 1960s, what you see is that correlation doesn't exist. Despite the steady increase to police budgets since the 60s, crime has actually increased and in fact outpaced it in many urban areas. So to Denise's point, what police really do when it comes to crime is make it disappear. You know, you put it in a jail, you move the homeless person down the street. And so this is, and in this way, this is kind of how we create this these sort of sterile zones of a suburbs, right, that exist and have this sort of open and kind of safe environment because they're just moving and offsetting these problems to a separate place where it's more acceptable, because that's what we've created by virtue of this budget. We establish these zones where it's acceptable and where it's expected that they're going to be underfunded and hyper criminalized, and you move all of the problems there. And so it's just important to think or to remind yourself that policing doesn't solve crime. There's someone that you call after the fact of a crime, and they only serve to really manage social problems.
With that, I think I want to go ahead and close out the question period and bring our webinar to a close. I'm going to abuse my power a little bit as the moderator and just make a point that all of this effort to have this conversation, make these observations about the nature of policing, walk us through the budget, all of these things require so much effort and so much labor and frankly personal risk. This work doesn't come without risk, especially for the organizers who are Black, who are trans, who are women. You know, they face a lot of abuse around the country for standing up for the rights of everyone when they do this, because when we defund police, again, everybody's made safer. And so I just want to stress to everybody who's watching that it's important to financially support those that are doing this work. You know, so follow the Black Futures Collective on Instagram, donate to them. You know, when you see these people out in public, offer them support. Let them know you appreciate what they're doing, because this work to improve our city, it's a collective effort, but there are some people who are, you know, really engaging in a lot of personal sacrifice, and it's on us to show solidarity with those individuals. So first and foremost, you know, support the Black Futures Collective. You know, the work that Texas Appleseed is doing on the research side is so vital for us to understand these budgets, the criminal justice system, the way the carceral system works. So definitely support Texas Appleseed. The Immigrant Legal Resource Center is looking at the way that the carceral system, you know, impacts immigration, and immigration, you know, is not a separate issue from a Black issue. There are Black undocumented folks. I recommend folks follow the hashtag #UndocuBlack and the UndocuBlack movement. Understand that these are not separate fights, and the organizers on this call demonstrate that this is a multiracial movement. So support the ILRC and the work that they do against the carceral complex for immigrants, fight back against immigrant detention, and support what they do. Register to vote, right? Your local DA impacts these cases significantly. Your judges impact these cases significantly. So support groups like Move Texas. Definitely support educators who are also a sponsor of this event. They're fighting back against unsafe opening of schools. You know, and the lives of children are jeopardized by that activity. A lot of Black and brown children in that conversation. So support the work of our educators, have solidarity with one another, and please share this information. It's very important that we educate first, because this is a conversation that has a lot of stigma at the moment. It's suffered a lot of right-wing abuse. It suffered a lot of mocking. And I think that this panel is a testament to the fact that there's a lot of research, right? There's a lot of heart, there's a lot of wisdom behind this sentiment. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Again, support the Black Futures Collective. Thank you to everybody who participated on this panel. I'm more than blessed, more than humbled to be able to speak alongside these folks. And I hope everybody has a wonderful night.